Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of the political left and how it responds to war. My guest for this conversation is Marcello Musto. Marcello Musto is a professor of sociological theory at York University in Toronto, where he is also the founding director of the Laboratory for Alternative Theories. He is acknowledged as being one of those who have made significant contributions to the revival of Marxist studies over the last decade. He is the author of the book, The Last Years of Karl Marx, an Intellectual Biography, and he has a paper that is coming out soon in Critical Sociology called War and the Left, Considerations on a Checkered History. He joins me from Spain. Marcello Musto, it is a great pleasure, sir, to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you very much for having me.
You begin your paper about war and the left with the Congress of the International, which was held in 1868, in which the Congress adopted a motion that called for the final abolition of all war. As we start to talk about that, maybe first tell me about what is this Congress of the International? Oftentimes we refer to this as the First International. What was that?
Yeah, that's true. We call the International Working Men's Association, which was the first international association of the working class that was founded in 1864 in London. And it is usually called the First International because there were many others after, inspired by this idea that workers should come together and should do the class struggle together with international solidarity. So this is actually the birth of internationalism. And of course, as you can imagine, the opposition to war was one of the main topics in the International. Not at the very beginning, because of course the International was focusing on labor, strike, opposition to exploitation, etc. But very quickly in the First International, and I will say very quickly in general in the history of labor movement, the opposition to war became a central topic. The opposition to the idea that workers of different countries all of a sudden must fight against each other, must kill against each other among them. And it is for this reason that in this Congress that was held in Brussels in 1868, one very well-known delegate, his name was César de Pape, he started to speak, perhaps for the first time, about the idea of organizing a general strike against war. This is exciting and made history because for the first time workers are not only talking about bread, but they're talking about roses, they're talking about the idea of preserving themselves. And what I like more about this document, this discussion that was very alive, is that they believed and they wrote down in the resolutions that all wars should be considered civil wars, not only wars within a single country. Like if today within the United States there is a war between people of one state and another, is considered civil war. This is bad, right? The word civil war. It is sort of alarm and it's good. But why, if the war is against a Canadian or a Mexican, should be seen in a different ways? We are all workers. We are all citizens. Every war is a disaster. Every war should be stopped. This is the first message of the First International.
That every war is a civil war based on class?
Every war is a civil war because they mean that people will kill each other, right? So they should be abolished. And workers should not do what bourgeois government asks them to do, to go to war and, to engage sometimes in crazy operations or power operations. I mean, this is something, perhaps the second aspect, if we want to move forward, that is an important contribution, a compelling contribution of the First International. The fact that wars are, for the first time, with the significant theoretical and economical explanations, war are explained not in terms of, psychological motivations. The king has done this, the queen has done that, or mostly because of ideological and political reasons. But there is a very strong emphasis that is given to the economics, to the economic side. And therefore, in the First International first, and then in the labor movement, there is this idea that capitalism is connected to wars, that wars are inevitable under capitalist mode of production and, social relations.
So in war, workers are killing workers. Hence, that's the Civil War aspect of it.
Yeah.
The First International, do you see this as the beginning of a modern left? I know we get sort of the notion of left-right politics going back to the French Revolution before, but do you see this First International as sort of the beginning of what we see as the left today?
I will go back to the French Revolution. I'm very traditional from this point of view, and we cannot ignore this almost century of history that happened between 1789 and 1864. But something very relevant about the First International is that class struggle is now conceived not only in terms of your own country, but class struggle is now conceived internationally. And there is the idea that actually, if you do not organize international solidarity, you will not be able to win or even to resist. Because if there is a strike and the capitalists are calling, workers from Ireland in a strike in Manchester, in London, well, there is no way that you will win, that the strike will go on and win in the end. So it is considered like, absolutely necessary to have international solidarity. And perhaps from this point of view, the labor movement arrived to this before capitalism, right? Today, on the contrary, with globalization and with the ideological counter-revolution that, in my opinion, we are living around many countries in the globe, in the world, then the labor movement has lost this international dimension, this dimension of internationalism. But certainly this passage, 1864, is very important. And going back to war, it is essential in order to do a coherent opposition to war. It's an essential message. Internationalism is the key element of the First International.
Did Karl Marx write about war?
Yes, Karl Marx wrote about war. He wrote a lot and about many things. But he never wrote about war in the sense of, let me explain what war is, or let me tell the workers what they should be doing. The second element, it is actually a characteristic of Marx. Despite what many people who have not read Marx or have read Marx very superficially believed, Marx hated the idea, I'm going to write on a piece of paper today in 1867 what you people have to do in Australia or in United States today in 2022. That is not Karl Marx, and particularly with war, because Marx was an analyst of capitalism, basically. So the intellectual task of Marx is trying to understand the laws of tendency of capitalism. And of course, in this incredibly difficult task, he had not the possibility to write about this many other topics. But he wrote about many wars, not about war in general, but about many wars. And do you know why? Because Marx was a journalist for almost 2 decades of his life, and for 12 years, from 1851 to 1862, he was actually a prominent correspondent of the most sold newspaper in the United States, the New York Daily Tribune. And of course, Marx is also writing about many wars. Most of the time, the articles were signed by Karl Marx, but they were actually written by Friedrich Engels, who was called the General. This was his nickname in the Marx family. He was really an expert of war and is actually the person who wrote more than Marx consistently about war. Let me say, if I may, just very briefly, that when Marx is writing about geopolitics, or what we call today IR, international relations in Europe, he actually took always the position against Russia. This is very fun. And actually, these were things that Marx published. There are many things unpublished by Marx that were published later, right, by Engels, by many other people. But it is funny to see that some of the documents, a book also, I will try to come back to this later if we have time, or articles that were written by Marx, they were not republished in Soviet Union for many, many years. And you know why? Because Marx represents Russia in the way it was at the time, the biggest counter-revolutionary power that intervened in Europe, supporting conservative governments every time there was, a social, a progressive upheaval, riots or revolution, etc. And if you change the word Russia and you put the word Soviet Union and you think about Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the many other interventions of Soviet Union, then, this might have been a little bit complicated from the Communist Party of Soviet Union to see that Marx himself was making a critique that from some point of view could be seen similar to the critique of many people against the interventions of Soviet Union.
We're definitely going to get into this. Did Marx and Engels also believe in the abolition of war? Did Marx and Engels also believe in the full abolition of war, as you would see?
Abolition of war, yes. Sorry. Abolition of war, yes. They were not naive. And there is this heritage of the left that goes back to the French Revolution. And this is a very important aspect to consider, and something that I had to deal with this when I was writing my paper. The heritage is the idea that started with the Revolutionary Wars of 1792, so after the revolution in France, the idea of exporting the revolution. This is not true. This is not new, sorry. It is something that when we hear these things, we think very negatively about Blair, about Bush, etc. But the idea of exporting freedom, it is something that also belonged to the left in 1792. The idea that France is now revolutionary, and therefore, if there is a revolutionary war, social and political conditions can improve everywhere in Europe. So the left is influenced by this idea, Marx and Engels as well, and Lenin. If we have time, we can talk about this. But I want to say something important for me. Robespierre didn't think about this. He didn't agree with this idea. Robespierre was extremely careful about this, and he always opposed to the idea that revolution can be exported with the bayonet outside France. The problem is that, and this is really dramatic, not only ironic, but dramatic, is that France's most known people of this age is Napoleon, who contributed to the death of hundreds of thousands of people. And we usually think about Robespierre in terms of, a bloody politician.
The terror.
The terror, etc., etc. In any case, to answer completely to your question, of course, always superficially as we can do in the limited time that we have, I must say that there is something that very few people know. Friedrich Engels, at the end of his life, 2 years before he died, when he was 73, very, very old, and when he was still editing the volume 3 of Capital, he had to finish this, right? This was the most important thing, complete the magnum opus of Karl Marx. He wrote about war, and he was very preoccupied with this issue. And he wrote a pamphlet, a series of articles that circulated a lot and that also became a pamphlet. The title was Can Europe Disarm? Very, very interesting when I found out this for the first time. And I thought that I should use this and bring this to a wider audience. And Engels believed that in Europe at the time, imagine now, there was an unprecedented level of arms production everywhere in the so-called old continent. So Engels said, here there will be a war of destruction that we have never seen. And if we don't stop this buying new arms, and also Engels was against the system of a standing army, right? They were in favor of a rotation, like, people, ordinary people from the proletariat, they should become part of the army, like, the old French tradition, not this professional army that were, for him, very dangerous. In any case, if we don't stop this now, Europe will see a very dramatic bloody war, which is something that happened not too many years after Engels died in 1914.
World War One.
World War One, yeah.
Which is interesting because before, and I guess we're sort of glossing over here, the Second International, which would happen before World War One, and we could talk more about it. But it is interesting because it is World War One where we'd see a breakup of this idea of the abolition of all war and of supporting World War One. Many socialists ended up supporting that war. So this would cause a great divide within the left.
Yes, it's a very, very intense history, how the left arrived at the beginning of World War One. And actually, I am fascinated by this because when today we have to face one more time, we know that the reason why we are talking about this is because we have to face once again a dramatic war, and we are trying to discuss how the left progressive forces should look at this war, what to do, right? But we have to go back to history, and that's why history is always so important. And the history of labor movement is particularly rich because it is not the first time for us to face questions like, what is a war of defense? Is this a just war? What should we do if there is a just war, etc.? So these are things that the left is at the beginning discussing in theory. And this is the debate that we had so far. Marx, Engels, the First International. But starting from this period, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, particularly when there is a very aggressive imperialistic policy of many European countries, Germany more than any other country, well, this is now a real concrete political issue. It is not only about theory, what is going to happen if there is a war. And the Second International, that is the organization that started in 1889, 100 years after French Revolution, so emblematically, and that's very important for the people who are listening, the Second International collapsed because of war. It ended in 1914 because there was a dramatic split. A part of the socialist parties supported the war credit in each of their countries. This was a shift with the policy that they had before. Because when the International, let me go one step back. When the International was founded in 1889, in the founding documents, we read that actually peace is an indispensable precondition of any emancipation of the working class. It's written there. Peace is essential. And this goes back to many early socialists, like, for example, Saint-Simon, because they believe that production is important for poor people to improve their condition. And if there is war, there is not the basic prerequisite to produce and flourish, emancipate, etc., etc. But what is going to happen is that nationalism, that is another very strong ideology that is starting and becoming stronger and stronger and more powerful in this period. There are many studies about this. Perhaps one of the most known was written by the famous historian Eric Hobsbawm, is becoming hegemonic and is entering also in socialist parties, social democratic parties. They changed the name and turned into Communist Party only after Russian Revolution in 1917. One of the first was, for example, the Italian Communist Party, 1921, then the French Communist Party in 1920, in this period, right? So what is happening is that a majority of the socialist parties, also because of imperialism and also because of the promise that the workers would have improved their conditions, not because of class struggle against the capitalist, but because of the wealth that each of this country would have gotten after an imperialist conquest, right? So this is the way that the bourgeoisie is trying to corrupt these socialist leaders in parliament, and that's why they voted in favor, the famous vote in favor of the war credits. So they started to give a little bit of political freedom to these parties and to tell them, you know, this is a train, and the train is arriving also in the houses, the train of wealth, the train of economic improvement. It will go from bourgeoisie, middle class, and then it will also gain working class. It wasn't like this. And in the end, we know that history was the support of these progressive forces to war was a disaster. Because if still today you travel to Europe, and there are many parts of Europe that in which you can see the dozens of thousands of people who died in World War I. And then, as we know, many books, many analysis, the end of World War I prepared the bigger disaster, right? World War I was not called World War I, was called the Great War. But there was something that was even greater and was even bigger and more disastrous, and this was the Second World War. But I don't want to run too much if we want to focus on this debate of, 1914 and what happened to the left in this period.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Marcello Musto, Professor of Sociological Theory at York University in Toronto, where he's also the founding director of the Laboratory for Alternative Theories. He joins us for a conversation about the history of war and the left. He is the author of the book, The Last Years of Karl Marx, and Intellectual Biography, also the author of a paper that soon will be published by the journal Critical Sociology called War and the Left, Considerations on a Checkered History. Tell me about this debate about World War I then. What were the two sides saying and coming from the left?
The debate starts when socialist forces started to understand that perhaps a war was inevitable. And there is a dramatic debate that also ended like, split in political parties, the end of political friendships, the things that we know about the history of the left. The majority of the forces, in particular, the oldest party in the world, the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, they followed this idea. They were not the only one. The same happened in Europe, in other countries, in Italy, in France, in England. They voted in favor and supported war. But there were two figures in this period. One was Rosa Luxemburg, a Polish woman who was a member of the SPD, and another one was Lenin, who became later the most important figure in communism in the 20th century, we can say, that were very powerful in this period. Rosa Luxemburg made, and this is a definition that I like to call, not only opposition to war, but she talked about anti-militarism. Anti-militarism for Rosa Luxemburg is essential, and her main slogan was war to war. So the idea that labor movement should fight for peace, not only when there is a war, but also in peacetime. You must prepare the peace. You must keep the peace, right? You must do policies for example, the idea that there should be not a professional army. For example, the idea of reducing the expenses, the part of the budget that you give as a state, as a government every year. Or, for example, the idea, this was more coming from a moderate sector of socialists and social democrats, but there are international courts, right? In case of a dispute, instead of creating the condition for the war, you go there and you discuss. And, every democratic government should do like this and then should accept the outcome of this. I remember this is something that happened recently, for example, between Bolivia and Chile a few years ago, when Bolivia wanted to have a way to the sea and Chile was against this. But going back to this, so Rosa Luxemburg, the main goal of the proletariat, the main goal is fighting imperialism and preventing wars. She was essential from this point of view. And these socialists are now reorganizing themselves in new conferences. One of them was in Zimmerwald, in Kintal, in Switzerland, because sometimes they were in jail. I mean, these are dramatic times. Lenin was as powerful as Rosa Luxemburg in terms of looking at the global South. I think that this part of Lenin is underestimated sometimes, and sometimes we only criticize him for this often too much rigid idea about revolution, the political party, the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. But Lenin was extremely brilliant in order to criticize the historical falsification of liberals, of the capitalist ideology of the time, that they were doing these wars for national liberations. Actually, Lenin talked about wars of plunder, and Lenin said that the objective of the war, the goal of the war, is just to see which imperialist power is going to exploit and destroy countries from the global South. So this is something to pillage the colonies and to oppress foreign people. And from this point of view, Lenin is also giving a positive idea of the concept just war.
Yeah.
Lenin said just wars are the wars that people of subjugated countries that have been, subjugated by imperialism of European powers, they have the right to do because they want to liberate themselves, they want to emancipate themselves. And Lenin said another important thing, this is perhaps one of the most famous slogans of the labor movement: turn imperialistic war into civil war. Because if there is a war and something is happening, then there is a new political scenario that can change everything. And this is the idea of Lenin. And this is actually what happened in Soviet Union in 1917, few years after the beginning of World War I in 1914.
So were Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, did they disagree when it came to ideas of a just war?
Luxemburg and Lenin did disagree with a very significant leader, a very well-known leader, not in the United States, but in France. His name was Jean Jaurès. Because Jean Jaurès wrote a book in 1911 that was called The Army. In this book, Jaurès, The New Army, in this book, Jaurès is defending the idea that there can be a just war also in Europe, also between European countries. The disagreement of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg in particular, she wrote a very useful review of this book, and some of these ideas can be applied in the contemporary scenarios. She said, if we have to debate war from the point of view of who starts the war, then the situation might be a little bit tricky and complicated, because she said historical phenomena such wars cannot be measured with the yardstick of, defense and aggression. She said there might be a big power, a big state that is actually provoking another one to start the war, and then this other one is starting the war, and then a just war is there. I mean, every comparison with contemporary things is is to be taken cum grano salis, right? Very, very carefully. But the interesting things of women, wonderful, important women, I just mentioned one, Rosa Luxemburg, the fight against this idea that there could be an armed nation, because when there is a war, there is an armed nation. And when there is an armed nation, like a mobilization in favor of war, there are these feelings of nationalism and, chauvinism, etc., that in the end are very, very bad for labor movement and for emancipation. That's why this scheme turned a civil war into revolutionary war is complicated and should be considered very, very carefully. The second woman who wrote something a few years after Rosa Luxemburg, 1933, a very short but wonderful article called Reflections on War, just before Hitler, etc., is Simone Weil. So Simone Weil wrote, no matter what it may take, let me read this quotation that I have here, fascism, democracy, or dictatorship of the proletariat, the principal enemy remains the administrative, police, and military apparatus. The idea that when there is a war, it is the apparatus of the state, the regressive apparatus of the state, that is gaining power.
That always wins. It always wins in war.
That always wins. I mean, we cannot say always, but, very, very often. And I want to say that we are talking about, we have been talking about communist, socialist, Marxist tradition. But if I may, with your permission, I would like to say that these divisions, this split sometimes about war were lines of demarcation also within the anarchist movement and within the feminist movement. And if we mention one person who was very, very well known at the time, if I say anarchism, many people will say Bakunin, right? We know Bakunin well. But perhaps the second most famous anarchist was Kropotkin, Russian like Bakunin.
Peter Kropotkin, yeah.
Exactly. Peter Kropotkin, who said just before, the beginning of the war, around 1914, etc., that the task of any person holding dear the idea of emancipation, human progress, etc., was to squash Germany invasion in Western Europe. So once again, we have a case similar like the one that we are considering today. Russia, a counter-revolutionary power who is invading and is doing an act of, brutal war, invasion, and all the things that we know. And Kropotkin, an anarchist, a very radical thinker and a believer of, position to capitalism, war, etc., is actually taking position against Russia. And a position that says we should participate, we should intervene actively against Russia. I've been talking about these things once again because it is interesting to see what happened in the past and how can we learn from the lessons of the past. So it seems plausible, the idea that Putin is invading and we, Kropotkin, believe that the idea of a general strike against war, that is the slogan of anarchist movement. Every time there is a war, we should do a general strike. But then Kropotkin is saying, you know what? We call for the general strike. Only a very small portion of workers will agree to the general strike. And then what are we doing? We are actually indirectly helping Germany to win and to have a conservative power, gaining force in Europe. So dramatic, the most important representative of anarchism is writing this. But at the same time, the majority of anarchists, and I like this position, I agree with this position. One of them was an Italian, his name was Enrico Malatesta. Like Luxemburg, like Simone Weil, they said that when there is a war, anytime there is a war, anytime that this mechanism starts, it is not good to intervene and to support the state, this part of the state, to support the increase of army and, the war machine. So Malatesta wrote, a German victory will certainly spell the triumph of militarism, but also a victory of the alliance, at the time was Russia and England, will do the same. It is another kind of domination. And in the anarchist manifesto against Kropotkin, the anti-war manifesto of 1915, they wrote, none of the belligerents has any right to lay claim to civilization, just as none of them is entitled to claim legitimate self-defense. So it is for the mechanism that I was mentioning before, when Rosa Luxemburg is criticizing Jean Jaurès. And the same debate is also taking place in feminism, because at the beginning, war was something positive for women. They could finally work because they had to replace men who were sent to the front to die, to fight, and sometimes to die. So they saw this as a possibility to demonstrate that they were, of course, able, like men, or sometimes, as we know, better than men to work. But the communist leaders, the women communist leader of this period, Rosa Luxemburg is one of them, but there were many others, like Clara Zetkin in Germany with the German Social Democracy, or Kollontai in Russia, or, for example, Sylvia Pankhurst in England. Well, they demonstrated that actually this idea of evoking the enemy at the gate, there is a war, we should all unite because the enemy is now outside, it was used very smartly by liberal governments, by bourgeoisie. You know that liberal in Europe means something very different from the United States, conservative, not progressive. Well, they use war in order to roll back fundamental social reforms. That's very important. And another thing is that the struggle against militarism was considered by these women as an essential struggle against patriarchy. It is for this reason that starting from this period, and then later for the International Women's Day, the 8th of March, etc., the opposition to war, the opposition to increase the budget, the economic budget for army, etc., was a key element of feminism and a key element of many platforms of international feminist movement.
So this idea of not supporting either, then what to do? What was was it just to sit out, or?
That's a question that, of course, was considered by the labor movement in different ways, depending on which were the parties there. In World War II, that is what is happening in the historical period that we arrive to describe and to debate now, of course, they were in favor of an intervention against Nazi fascism, against the alliance made by Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and then extended to Japan later. But in cases like the one of World War I, 1914, where there are imperialist powers, different imperialist powers with the same agenda to conquer and to exploit other people, then the idea of is not supporting any kind of war and not being part of this, and actually to create an international dimension of solidarity, or in the case of Lenin, using the disastrous policies of this government who created economic crisis and the death of hundreds of thousands of people to do a revolution. And as I said before, to turn civil war into revolutionary wars. These are the policies at the time. But of course, after World War I would say it was very difficult to have this slogan. Imagine Europe destroyed after World War I. And it is not easy to go to the working class and say, we are hoping that there is, this was not the hope, but the idea, if there is a new war, we will turn this war into a revolutionary war. So the idea is more creating a sort of like Rosa Luxemburg was arguing before, the conditions for peace or the condition for revolution that could happen in many ways. But of course, now we are talking about the world, not only France or Germany. And you will understand that responses are difficult. I cannot provide an answer in general. Mao Zedong is doing the revolution in China, and he's writing, Problems of War and Strategy in 1938, or the famous Unprotracted War in the same year. So, of course, if you read Mao Zedong in this year, there is a sort of omnipotence of revolutionary war. It looked like the French Revolutionary in 1792. And actually, once again, you can read this quotation, only with guns can the whole war be transformed, right? But in Europe, things are different. And there are some leaders of the Third International, because now there was a Third International, the Communist International, established in 1919 after Soviet Union became a state in 1917. Well, there were some leaders who tried to create. There were many changes in policy in this period, conditions for wars. But everybody knew that a new 1914, as they used to say, a new 1914, a new war was inevitable. And that's why we have to remember that the left is very divided at the time. Rosa Luxemburg was killed when there were social democrats at the government in Germany. So for a long time, and this is just one example, for a long time, it is difficult for these forces, social democratic and communist forces, to merge together, to do an alliance against Nazi fascism, because they were fighting against each other. And it took a lot of time to create this popular front policy, right? All the progressive forces, the democratic forces to join together.
Of course, no two moments in history are exactly alike. There's always many differences, but I still couldn't help but think of some of the similarities, at least within the debate among the left concerning war, thinking about Germany in World War I, before World War I, and the left's response to it, and then the debate that we see today concerning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the division that we have today.
Yes, because there is one position that is unfortunately coming back repeatedly in history, and the position is that the forces of the left, in the end, directly or indirectly, they became co-belligerent. So in the end, they decide to do what, in my opinion, is a big mistake, the mistake of voting in favor of expanding the expenses for army and wage raise, etc. This is something that we are looking today as well. Like today we are talking about an extension of NATO, and this is happening in Finland with the support of the radical left and the Social Democratic Party. There has been a big debate there and a split. In Spain, there is a progressive government, but they are also participating in this way. And actually, the expression Union Sacrée was created in France in this context. So in the context that all the national forces, all the parties should ally and should support the war. In my opinion, this is extremely dangerous for the left, because in the end, there is no distinction between leftist forces, revolutionary or reformist forces as well, and the conservative forces. And today, there is also a risk of, hiding what NATO is. And the risk is, I apologize for my cats that are also...
We're all broadcasting from home, so...
Yeah. And the idea is that, if there is not a clear position against NATO, then Atlantism and pacifism can be, misinterpreted, and they could be considered the same. So from this point of view, there is a nice quotation of Karl Marx that I would like to share with you, because Marx was writing about Russia at the time of the Crimea War, right, in the 1850s. And Marx said that one merely needs to replace one series of names and date with others, and it becomes clear that the policies of Ivan III and those of Russia today are not merely similar, but identical. So this is the quotation these are the kind of things that Marx wrote that I was mentioning before, the things that will make the nomenclatura of the Communist Party of Soviet Union be very worried about Marx. But Marx is also writing in New York Daily Tribune this idea of being careful and opposing to liberal Democrats who wanted to, go against Russia and create a coalition against Russia. So let me read this quotation for the people who are listening. He said, "It is a mistake to describe war against Russia as a war between liberty and despotism, apart from the fact that if such be the case, liberty would be the nonce represented by Bonaparte. The whole above object of the war is the maintenance of Vienna treaties, those very treaties which annul the liberty and independence of nations." So when I reread this article written by Marx, I said, if we replace Bonaparte with NATO and with the United States of America and Vienna treaties with NATO, well, this observation seems to be written for today, because of course we know that this war, and this is not at all, absolutely not at all, a justification for what is done. But, we have to be careful to see what are the historical and the geopolitical, condition that also co-determined war. And therefore, I am very worried about leftist forces not supporting, Ukrainian people, which we should do, but not opposing to NATO and not considering NATO as a dangerous and also ineffectual organization, because it is actually part of some tensions leading to war around the world in the past years, in the past decade, also after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991.
We are down to our final 5 minutes, and my next question we can do an entire hour on by itself, so you will forgive me for this one. But I would hate to end this without talking about this, and that is Russia and the left, and how it has seemed, and I think we can go back to the split between Stalin and Trotsky, where we've seen the left divided over Russia ever since. And then I still think we see it today.
Yes, perhaps even more than an hour we can talk about this. Russia...
Probably should have been my first question.
And the Soviet Union, they had a very conflicted attitude with war. And I was mentioning at the beginning of our conversation these other invasions that were made by Soviet Union. 1956, 1968, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, also the very famous one, Afghanistan in 1971. And let me also mention the Sino-Russian Wars, because this idea that wars are mostly related to capitalism, when then there are two so-called socialist countries like China and Soviet Union, and they fight against each other in Vietnam, at the borders between Vietnam and China, then, there are very dramatic contradictions. And let me also mention this idea of, the coming from Khrushchev, peaceful coexistence, right? This important policy that started in 1961. This is something that didn't apply, according to, the Communist Party of Soviet Union, to the socialist bloc. So Khrushchev said that when there are forces hostile to socialism in one country, and the general secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union was deciding if whether a force was hostile to socialism or was actually trying to create more conditions for socialism and emancipation, like, for example, many times in history. Well, when this happens, this is no longer a question of that country, but it is a question of the socialist bloc, and therefore Soviet Union had the right to invade that country, as it happened against the Prague Spring in 1968. So it is a very contradictory, at least, politics, and this created a very negative things for the left, because many people started to associate imaging after 1968 in the 70s with all the social movements that were also movement for peace. They started to see Soviet Union as another imperialistic power, right? Like sometimes very similar to United States. And this made weak more left and not weaker and not stronger. So it is a debate that goes back to the 20th century, and hopefully we can talk about this on another occasion, because you just gave me 5 minutes.
Yes, and we will. Marcello Musto has been our guest. Again, Marcello Musto is Professor of Sociological Theory at York University in Toronto, where he's also founding director of the Laboratory for Alternative Theories. He is the author of the book, The Last Years of Karl Marx, and Intellectual Biography, which we will have him on in the near future to talk about. And he's also publishing a paper in the Journal of Critical Sociology called War and the Left, Considerations on a Checkered History. Marcello Musto, thank you.
Thank you very much.